What if I told you there was a Minecraft role-playing community with over 47,000 members? Of course, I'm talking about the Stoneworks server, one of the largest role-playing communities that Minecraft has ever seen. Here, you can create a nation, a religion, and culture. Now, this server and this current iteration in their world, they're almost 2 years running strong. And so all of the lore that they've accumulated, unlike a lot of places where it's much newer, all of this lore that's been created on the Stoneworks more or less actually happened. These are people who have written real-life events into their wiki pages, and the actions that they've committed as leaders of the nation and soldiers and farmers have consequences, and they've been living with them since the beginning. This is personally one of my favorite servers, and I want to give you the sort of rundown, the history, and show you how these groups of people, these 47,000 people and growing, sort of found ourselves here in May of 2022. How we got there and the plans for the future. Now, before we get into the informative business for today, I'd like to invite all of you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, tell your friends, and look into my Patreon if that's something you're willing to support. With that being said, let's get on to the video. Through all of this, you must know that a lot of the action happens through the Discord. This is where you get the server's announcements and its changelog and its demographics, who's playing where, etc. Messages from the admin. Not only that, however, but here is where a lot of the diplomatic RP gets done, right here in the main server. Here you can find player announcements, national announcements. Here is where you see pretty much the press briefings, sort of, the big announcements that come out of each nation. You can find them right here. And also towards the bottom, you can see the community coming together, making media, making art, and basically chatting and seeing what's going on. This is not strictly RP within the Discord, but a lot of the RP does take place within the sub Discords and the national Discords and in the server itself. And I know what you're saying. You're saying, Surf, silently in your mind, how did we get here? How did we get to this place where there's 45,000 of us and the player cap for the entire server is like over 400 people, like 200 people per server, Rathnir and Eldham? What happened? What happened between the beginning and now? And I'll tell you. I'll give you the whole story just between me and you. Don't tell anyone I told you this. So, this all started at about, I think, late October, early November of 2020. And we just had Rathnir, and the player cap was super low. We're talking about 100 people max if you didn't have the pass. And I'll put on the screen here the first map that was created, and I'll link all of the mappers that I use here in the description below for adequate credit. So, what you're looking at here is the first map of Rathnir, and you can see a ton of land that hasn't been taken yet, but at the same time, you can also see some of the original world powers that are still around today. These Minecraft nations have lasted over 2 years, and ones you might know of, Asharia, right there in the yellow, Imperial Asharian, with Alderash in the bottom left, Viadoxa in the bottom right, Bardonia in the lime green towards the top third, and then Imu Yaldal in the direct center there. This is one of my favorite maps here, not just because it's the first, but it's because there's a bunch of nations here that are still around today, and more that just you never hear about anymore. They've faded into irrelevancy, and this is some of the only history that references them to let us know they were there at all. And because they've been here for 2 years, they don't need to come up with lore anymore. Because, you know, you want to start out, you make a Minecraft nation, you don't want to make it so you're like, poof, they're out of nowhere, so you write a little backstory. These guys don't need that anymore. They've been here multiple years, and all of their lore is true. Like, they actually did it. This wasn't just a boon of their writing expertise. This actually happened and they can write about it. And that's sort of one of my favorite things that's going on here. Now we got on screen here is what Rathnir looked like a bit before, or like right sort of during the time that Eldham opened up. And we can see a lot of the same powers. We can see Asharia, which is now called Nidea. We got Yimu Aldal, we've got Viadox, we got Alderash, we got Bardonia, the boys. And this is a massive time in Rathnir history, because this is sort of the peak of what was known as the Dandelion Wars up to that point, where the leader of Bardonia, the Emperor, was on a world domination kick, and they had some of the best PvPers on the server, and they were just going around winning. They were sort of raiding places, taking places over, because the people, and this is sort of the stereotype, a lot of the people who really like world building don't really like fighting, and the people that do a lot of fighting don't usually do a lot of world building. And so there is this sort of balance that people try to get, where a lot of people that are just sort of minding their own business will get absorbed by people who only want to left click. You know what I'm saying? And this is the sort of the culmination of that, and this is about Bardonia at its greatest extent. Now the next picture here is what happened afterwards of the Third Allium Coalition War. This is what sent Bardonia into probably the darkest place they had ever been since they started, pretty much. From my understanding, and I did a whole video about this, is that the battle took place during a time where a lot of the Bardonian players could not be online, and so the capital of Bardonia was ransacked, and they were given a pretty much unconditional surrender, and they were chopped down to size in a big way. So the Third Allium Coalition War, in which Bardonia was wrecked, happened about a month after Eldham opened for the first time, and Eldham got a lot of people fleeing, is a safe word to say. If you were sort of a Bardonian and now you found yourself in a new country, or you felt like Rathnir was not as friendly to you, if your side lost a war or something, now you could go to Eldham. And here we can see the first map produced of Eldham, and what is first, most obvious, is Elysia. Elysia was this massive thing that ended up being not so massive. What they did was, when the server first opened, they came in with, they were a group of guys to start off with, and they just annexed a ton of territory, found whoever was living there and was like, we're good at PvP, you're going to be annexed, or we're going to kill you, and that's just how it's going to be. And they stayed for a little while. They stayed for a few days before everyone decided that this really wasn't what they wanted out of the Second World, all ganged up on them and partitioned their land and gave it to and basically anybody who wanted it. They just had to go through this agency called the Anti-Radicalism Syndicate in order to get this land. And Elysia was, not only because they were good at PvP, they were also just jerks about everything, and they were unkind to a lot of people, to the point where them being gone was in the best interest of a lot of people, and so they ended up doing something about it. This is sort of how most people start off with Eldham's history. Now, the discovery of Eldham itself is its own lore. Also, the sort of mapping of it in the first place is its own story as well. I know right when it first dropped, people were struggling to sort of figure out where everything was, just because, unlike Rathnir, this place hadn't been thoroughly mapped yet. So every day, some of the mappers, I think primarily Timokin, would post daily updates of everything that they've managed to map on Eldham until it was done, and everyone was very pleased to have that. But, like I said, usually Eldham history starts with the collapse of Elysia and its partition, and chaos ensues into the modern day. The fresh start that Eldham gave everyone ended up causing a bit of a sea change in the way that the player base conducted themselves. Because in Rathnir, there wasn't a whole lot of people, so there wasn't a whole lot you could do. You could be on the Discord, you can be in all the Discords and stuff and participate there. But on the server, there wasn't a ton of room to get in. Specifically before the queue started. Before the queue in the hub, you just had to sort of spam click the server until you, by luck, got in. And so a lot of people, it was sort of like 2B2T in the way that people would just try to be on as long as they could, just so they wouldn't have to go through trying to wade through a full server, trying to pinch in through a gap, you know, unless you got the pass, then it didn't really matter. But what Eldham started is international organizations in the way in which that different people communicated with each other. The heads of the nations communicated with each other, because with Eldham came a doubling in the server population. You also got like another 100 people that were able to be in the server, and it wasn't not too long after that before it doubled again, and then you could have 200 people per world, pretty much. And this international body I've been speaking on is called the UNE, the United Nations of Eldham. Now sort of defunct, but back at the beginning of Eldham's history, these guys were there. These guys were trying to get all of the world leaders together and sort of get like a big old summit going to discuss international projects. This included mainly road systems. Before this, they were just like the nations were connected through small roads and stuff like that, but now people wanted to really coordinate with one another and get these big old highways going through all of the continents and all the thing to get cohesive travel, cohesive communication. And this worked for a while anyway. And the UNE library became one of the largest sort of constructions on the server. The sort of intention there being collecting history, collecting information from all over the planet, that being Eldham and Rathnir as well, and storing it all in this big old facility that could theoretically house all of it and be a resource for all players. And I think that's beautiful, you know? I think that's one of the greatest ideas we've ever had. No, it had its flaws. It was prone to raids. It was prone to bandits, and we needed people to protect it. And that was sort of one of the reasons that it fell apart much later, and another reason being the administration that it took and the time commitment it took to have administrators. Because when you're in the UNE, if you were sort of trying to coordinate all this, you weren't really doing anything else. Your job description was an administrator, it was a communicator, it was all that sort of thing. And personally, I really liked it. I was a head librarian at one point, but I think people just lost interest. Lastly but not leastly, and the most important of modern news, is that when the cave update came out, the server lowered its sort of bedrock threshold to where the cave update made it, which was a massive thing. There was a big old business boom and strip mining operation, because at this point the sort of Stoneworks community within Rathnir had been going on for over a year, and the Eldham had been going on for about a couple months. And so the sort of gold stores and the diamonds and everything valuable has pretty much been mined out, and people were turning to other methods. Like in the hub, for example, you could sell cakes, you can sell rabbit stew, you could sell other things. And so people had tried to focus on these massive chicken operations, reed farms, things like that they could, which would allow them to mass produce cakes and stews and all that. And I kind of like that. I do like that, having alternatives other than mining. But it does start to come at the cost of resource wars. I know that the whole business in Rathnir with Ardat Mosul down in the Mesa biomes sort of create this this air of scarcity when it comes to precious metals, and resource wars will sometimes start. Rarely and seldom under the pretense of resource war, but in effect that's pretty much what happens. And so now you've got this big old situation where now there is so much more gold, there's so much more to be had in general, that everyone just sort of goes really deep underground in order to collect the most money as possible. Now, most recently, they've announced the third world. They've announced Kylorn, which is going to be a completely separate entity from Rathnir and Eldham. It's going to be strict RP. It's going to be crazy. Not much is known about it, however, but the first, I think, 100 plus people have been accepted. So they've got a bit of a whitelist going, and they've got the basic sort of tenets down where you really need to be on top of it. If you want to do a war, you need to have multiple justifications, and it's going to be super heavy on RP. No fooling around. Everyone's here to fight. Everyone's here to play the win, get the crown, save the crown, Mr. Krabs. You know what I'm saying? And that leads us to our next big section, which is a little bit more in depth. I'll be telling you a little bit more. I'll be telling you some stories that happened deep in the past in Rathnir and in Eldham, finally ending off with the current situation, who's in power, who's on the decline, and what we can expect in the future, or what I predict that's going to happen in the future anyhow. So, at the very beginning of Rathnir, and I mean by the time that the first map of Rathnir has been created, the world powers as they stood were Bardonia, Viadoxa, Alderash, Asharia, and the Sterling Crownlands. The Sterling Crownlands being the only one of those that hasn't lasted into the modern day. Alderash, you still live in my heart. You're out there somewhere and you're going to come back to me. I just know it. But by the time I got around in about late December of 2020, there were ruins, there were past civilizations there, particularly in Plagos. I know there's a video that I'll link probably on screen right now of when I found Gungum, an ancient Nidean sort of regional capital that had somehow been absolutely covered in sand, lost to time. I think this is one of the more fascinating stories that Stoneworks has to offer. You know, you're just minding your own business, you're walking around, you're trying to fill out a map, and all of a sudden it's just sand. It goes from forest to just sand. You're like, oh cool, I'm in a desert. You press F3, it tells you you're in a flower forest, and it's just sand. And a massive big dune towards the middle of that. And I was like, okay, I'll need some sand, I'll make some glass. I'm in the neighborhood. Only to find out that there's dirt under there, and so is a path. And this begins this massive process where I, with the help of some friends, excavate this place and show that there was this massive construction here. There was this big old temple, there was this big sphere of water. Probably one of my best memories, honestly. And it sort of just goes to show that there are places, there are memories, there are entire civilizations that are more or less lost to time, or at the very least in the depths of the wiki, yet to be discovered. Now, as the map filled out and wars happened and winners and losers became increasingly obvious through the test of time, money became an even greater factor than it already had been. And this is mercs. If you were in the middle of a war, it didn't matter how many guys you had. If you got declared war on, no matter how much manpower you had, you would buy mercenaries. Because if you didn't buy those mercenaries, the other side, with their money, were going to buy those mercenaries and use them against you. It's always sort of hedge betting kind of thing in order to guarantee your own survival in the event of a conflict. And these aren't the type of wars that we saw or that we can see today, where the result of wars will be much more reasonable, I guess, where if you'd lose a war, you'd lose a section of territory or whatever. If you overcame a different group of people by force of arms, it usually meant straight up annexation. A lot of the time, if you lost a war, you were going to be seeing some horrendous terms, because what were you going to do? Fight back? Your kit was gone. Your settlement, if you had like a main settlement, had been wrecked through TNT or any manner of thing that would come about through practical PvP strategy along the way. And sometimes specific nations would have their own merc groups. Like the merc group would operate out of a specific country, either taking money or doing the express will of the nation in question. And this can be seen with doing the nation's bidding and so forth in the spirits in Asharia and the Emperor's hands in Bardonia, two of the most, I'd say, feared legendary groups to come out of Stoneworks' past. They sort of operated as their personal nations, like vanguard. If they wanted something destroyed, or if they wanted the head of a particular enemy leader as like a vague humiliation thing, they would send their people after them, and they would just scour the earth for you until they got your head and brought it back to their emperor. This sort of PvP meta, where if you could left click better than anyone else, you ran the world pretty much. This got out of hand when a group called the Ferrymen showed up in where sort of Via Doxa is today. And the Ferrymen came from outside the Stoneworks server. They were expert PvPers, and they ended up wrecking pretty much every other PvPer in the Stoneworks server. So everyone sort of who is familiar with the way Stoneworks worked and the losers of PvP, they could see the writing on the wall. These guys were way out of left field. They were beating everybody. All of the best players had been defeated, and they didn't know what to do. And it got so bad that the admin had to step in and just ban all of them. It was crazy. And so I think that's where we started to take a hard look at conflict and PvP in the Stoneworks server and try to mitigate it as not harshly, but like not world conquesting through left clicking alone. You know what I'm saying? All this information within Rathnir puts us in the correct mindset that we need to be in once Eldham opens up. Now, Eldham opened about mid-June 2021, and the first powers to emerge out of there were Elysia, the Southern Stars, Aristios, the Forge, and Regnum Drakes. Now, we need to keep an eye on Southern Stars. Southern Stars are very important because a bit after Eldham opened, give it about a month after Eldham opened, Bardonia completely collapsed. They were defeated in a war, and all of their sort of vassal states declared independence, and they were left as a little bit of a rump state for a short while. However, if you look at the leadership of the Southern Stars, who was a world power on Eldham, you'll realize that the same people who were running Bardonia also were running the Southern Stars. This is, I'd give it a trope. This is a trope that the old leaders of Bardonia would do, where it'd still be the same administration, it'd still be the same people in power, but they would completely rebrand, you know? And they would do this again later, with the Eldham Trade Company, and most modernly, the Imperium. There's a lot of the same people. They tried to do it with the Magisterium, another nation in Rathnir, to varying degrees of success. This is all varying degrees of success, but if you know who the old leaders were, you can sort of pick them out, and they're all still in the same clique, if you will. Elysia 2, like I mentioned earlier, was supermassive but really empty, and ended up running afoul of the goodwill of everyone on Eldham and got axed for it. Now this, sort of after the fall of Elysia and its zoning and sort of breakup therein, led to the golden age of piracy. That's what I like to call it. In Eldham, the pirate nation of Barbossa was sailing the seas and torching things and killing people that they could find. And in Rathnir, the pirate empire of Tortuga, down in the south of Rathnir, was doing the same thing. This was a really big time in Stoneworks where you could really make a reputation for yourself and a lot of gold, sort of killing people and giving people a hard time through your sword arm, you know? But all of the Eldham major powers I've said so far, Elysia, Southern Stars, Aristios, the Forge, Regnum Dracius, with the exception of Aristios, all began to wane and fall victim to infighting and collapse, and eventually a second set of world powers emerged. These are including but not limited to Ravengard, the AWE, and Skjoldbreithir, the most powerful of which made up the Eldham Entente. And this became a problem because when all of the biggest nations, the most powerful nations in Eldham began to work together and vowed not to go to war against one another, it became extremely difficult when a war was declared from the Eldham Entente to defend yourself against it, because you had the 5 biggest nations, the most strongest nations in the server. You basically had to rally the rest of the server if you wanted to stand a chance, and that ended up sort of becoming a problem. That was until Araka showed up. Now, Araka ended up being one of the biggest nations Eldham had ever seen, eclipsing even Elysia in scope and especially player base. Now, these guys were a match and a half for the Eldham Entente. It's so much so that there had to be an intermediary in order to keep everyone from killing each other, to avoid half the world going to war with the other half of the world, which would have been crazy. It would have been probably the biggest event ever. But, we don't know what we don't know. Now, after February, things between Araka and the Eldham Entente began to fade, mainly because the Eldham Entente disbanded in February, and Araka would live on for a couple more months until their emperor would resign, their emperor being Neo. And Neo's resignation just showed how much of a little bit of a cult of personality Araka was at this time, because in early April of 2022, Araka completely collapsed. This was called the Old Banners Rebellion, and this all started with a big announcement from a player named Catalyst, and he called for everyone to join him. He said that Araka wasn't the way it should be since Neo left. They basically said that there was no military left, the administration was really poor, and he called on everyone to rise up with him. And he was joined immediately by the nations of Arctania, Catania, Valreach, Osria, Artholds, Ferencia, the Dandelion Empire, which is pretty much Bardonia, mind you, Eleanor, Stultum, the USSE, and a ton of others. This all happened on, like I said, April 4th, and nothing really recovered. This marks the end of Araka's sort of domination, I guess you could say, over Eldham. And since that time, a new power has arisen to take its place, but not on Eldham, mind you. This is in Rathnir. The Imperium has sort of taken Araka's place across the planet. Now, the Imperium is sort of a successor state of Nidea, Asharia, etc. Now, Bardonia is a part of the Imperium as well, so that is something you ought to keep in mind. Now, to protect against this, Eldham and Rathnir have a ton of alliance networks going. Now, this can be seen mainly in Eldham with the Constellation Alliance. This alliance, formerly called the Constellation of the North, takes up the entire upper left portion of Eldham. Not completely the sort of first quadrant, but a lot of it. There's also the Pale, which is another sort of Eldham alliance network. But we'll see how they do. The Imperium is encroaching. Now, the Imperium has a ton of colonies now within Eldham, and we'll see how far they can get. This is an ongoing thing, so we'll see how it goes. That has brought us up to date with what is going on in Eldham and Rathnir right now. But what's going on in the future? Well, a third world has been announced recently, known as Kylorn, and this one is going to be completely new, not sort of within the same world space as Rathnir and Eldham, and it's going to be completely RP heavy. This is not so much of a place to, I don't want to say goof around, but it's going to be taking itself a lot more seriously than Rathnir or Eldham do, for better or for worse. And this is just in time for the summer player surge, with everyone's semesters finishing up. A lot of people are going to have a mountain more free time, and they're going to be spending a lot of more time on their computers and wanting to play Minecraft. So we'll see how this is going to go, specifically because Kylorn is going to be exclusive and is sort of going to be for the most gung-ho of RP people. Now, This is probably going to make up for the player surge. It's going to keep everything in equilibrium, because with the player surge comes higher wait times and things like that. But Gjallar may, just like Eldham was, may, without the intention of this being so, creating a little bit of a pressure valve for new players to get into, or old players to get into, whilst freeing up space for a newer summer crowd. So we'll see how that goes. But tell me what you think about everything that I had to say. Tell me about Gjallar. Tell me your stories from Rathnir and Eldham, because I want to hear them, and I think other people are going to want to hear it too. So, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you next time.